Welcome back to week 1, part 2. In this next section of today's class, we want to look at the assumptions that people make, whether it be you and I in our Western societies, in the particular town and city and nation that we're in. What assumptions do we hold about truth, what we know, how we know, what is real all around us? And what assumptions do other people from different backgrounds make about what is true as well? We want to start with a statement that often we see and understand things not as they are, but as we are. So when we see an object, an animal, a plant, we usually describe it in some ways, and we use words to describe it, and we bring a whole heap of history to that. So some people might describe a snake in a certain way, using certain language, and it conveys certain cultural assumptions. Others might see it as a delicacy, and the same with other animals and insects. When we describe the weather, we may describe a sunny day or a rainy day in a certain way. Again, we bring to it certain assumptions about the way in which we see the world around us. Nancy Percy and Philip Johnson and others, in writing on Total Truth, Liberating Christianity from its Cultural Captivity, recognise that Christian perspectives on truth are also often tied to cultural situations. Take a moment now to think about the ways in which people from America or the United States, North America, might see the world. People from England or people from Europe might understand their world from what they call a Christian perspective. How is their culture shaping the way in which they view the world around them? People from different Christian traditions will also see the world in various ways, and often it's the culture around them that shapes the ways in which they see the world around them. And they're not alone. We could step into any department in the university, the psychology department, the science department, the chemistry department. They'll see the world from particular perspectives shaped by their subject, but also shaped by their culture. So truth is often seen through our worldviews. And understanding our worldview is like trying to see the lens in our own eye. That is, you have to take the glasses off and have a look at them before you can understand what's shaping the way in which you see the world around you. False beliefs lead to false worldviews. Distorted beliefs lead to distorted worldviews, and historical developments and movements in thinking could be discussed to help us to see the different ways in which people understand the world around them. In ancient times, the Egyptians saw the world one way, and over in Mesopotamia, other nations saw the world another way, and the Romans saw the world another way. And even in Jesus' time, the Pharisees saw their world in one way, the Sadducees another way. And Jesus said, this is the truth that God is wanting to reveal to us. And so we have a Jesus and Christian view of the world that he brings that changes and challenges the world of his time. Through history, we can see a medieval world that was challenged by Martin Luther in 1500. As he said, as he reads the Psalms and Romans and Galatians and other biblical books, there is a new way, which we should be looking at the world, in which education is more valued rather than just accepting what people say, in which the individual's way of viewing the world is more valued, in which conscience is more valued. And so with the Protestant Reformation brings a change in the way the world is viewed. And 100 or 2 years later, in 1700 and 1600, we see that the Enlightenment period brings another way of seeing the world. The Romantic period brings another way of seeing the world. And then through the 1800s into the 1900s and the 20th century, we see a particular scientific way of viewing the world, an individualistic way of viewing the world. And then after World War II, we see an even more consumeristic way of viewing the world. So our world is changing. And in Total Truth, Liberating Christianity from its Cultural Captivity, Nancy Percy and Philip Johnson challenge people to see the world as it is, as God has created it, rather than as our culture describes it. Culture can be very useful in helping us to see the world in better ways, but it can also take us to the left or right of what is true. Peter Vardy, in his book on what is truth, the British academic, theologian, philosopher and author from Haythrop College in London, Peter Vardy has said that many deny the validity of a search for truth, because if one culture, an island, a nation has a view of truth and another has a view that's a little bit different, how do we understand what is true? And Vardy would argue that you allow all of these different parties to discuss what is true and to come to a closer understanding of what is true, rather than simply accept what one group or person says. That is, we live in community with others, and truth can be achieved and reached more closely through communal interaction and networking. His book charts a course between the opposing movements of relativism, where we all create our own view of truth, and religious fundamentalism, in which authorities say this is the truth. In the middle, where evangelicalism and many other Christian groups have sought to position themselves, there is a seeking to locate as accurately as we can a God-revealed and scientifically revealed understanding of truths, combined with a humility that recognizes we're growing in our understanding of truth, and there is so much more that is not fully known about truth. Just the other day, I was attending a conference in which they were talking about the brain and consciousness, and quite a number of speakers said we need to recognize how little we know about consciousness and how the brain contributes to consciousness. Sure, we can understand neurons, we can understand the chemistry, we can understand what's happening in certain illnesses, but it's hard to fully understand everything that's going on because there is so much that we don't yet know about. And so as we look at Aristotle, Plato, Wittgenstein, Freud, Nietzsche, Kant, others can give us insights into the changing views on what is truth over the years. In Australia, the legacy of our history, and in Western nations, in Europe, North America, means that religious and ethical issues often aren't dealt with as they once were in schools. Says Peter Vardy, there's a focus and concentration on particular academic subjects without looking at big questions and issues of character. I totally respect that, says Vardy, but we don't address fundamental issues about the nature of reality, or values, or ethics, or religion. And 70% or more of people in the world are motivated and guided by their religious views, and yet in secular schools that can often be left out. And so private schools have more scope to teach religion and values, but often there's a need for training in order to enable students to engage with the big questions of faith, and to engage with ways in which these change during the life journey. But he says we need Australians who are the finest scientists, but we also need people who are ethically informed, and that's a vacuum that he says that needs to be addressed. So we need a holistic understanding of truth, which incorporates all of the different subject areas that we look at and all of the different ways of knowing that are true for us. Vardy says that since Immanuel Kant, there's been an emphasis on reason, scientific truth, materialism, measuring, empiricism, which has impoverished other ways of looking at the nature of the human person and their failures and weaknesses, the human condition, and how people can change and be transformed and grow and become more complete and whole and mature. Vardy says he's a philosopher, he analyses good arguments, but he thinks that often there's a lot of insights that have been left out of ways in which we seek to understand humans, their weaknesses, and also the way their weaknesses can be addressed. In Peter Vardy's book, God Matters, he says, at a time when religion tends to disappear from the public sphere and many different areas of society, the authors in God Matters invite us to again see the importance of putting God at the center of reflection on what is true, because God gives us an outside this world understanding of that which is good and true and important and values All of these are included in our understanding of God. And without that, if we simply say we're going to attempt to find truth by simply exploring the immediate locality around us, then we're less likely to find it than if we look at that which is outside of truth. And as we look at arguments for the existence of God, we'll see some of the reasons why this is seen by many to be logical and true, that an understanding of God is helpful for understanding what is true. An emphasis on accurate terms like religion, faith, and belief is also important, because often that which is described as religion, faith, or belief mightn't describe that which is true religion, faith, or belief. And then there's other examples of Hindu, Muslim, Jewish wisdom that could be considered, and other examples of different Christian perspectives on truth. In Barty's book, he says, growing awareness of the inadequacy of religion at times shouldn't make God less important, but rather more important. We need greater skills in understanding how we understand and perceive God, and the application of our understanding of God. Disagreement around religion shouldn't lessen the need for religion. There is still a need, perhaps an even greater need for religion. So what is belief? Perhaps human beings, like animals, are driven to survive, but perhaps there is more to a human person, more to life. And surely the anticipations and drives within says that that's true. And Vardy says nothing matters more than this religious drive within. So in this class, we're going to be equipping people, both Christians who are seeking to combine their faith with academic understandings of different subject areas, science and maths and humanities, and others too outside the faith, to combine their view of what life and the world is about with the specific topics that they are looking at, maths and science. There's going to be a combination of the big questions about the universe with the specific details of the subjects we're looking at, and how we know, how we understand, how we gather information. And we can look at some small details and examples, but sometimes we need to step back a bit and say, what are 5 or 6 or more general principles that are going to be important, and how do we communicate them, and how do we apply them in 5 or 6 or 7 different subject areas? Equipping students to thrive in, and at times highly secularized, even hostile environments, not a matter of protecting them in a shell. The shell could crack under pressure as they leave one series of year levels and go on to the next sequence of life and study. They need to be equipped in heart and mind to be able to address the big questions that they face. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, stupidity is more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. That is, people often fail because they don't have true knowledge. Against stupidity, we're defenseless. Neither protests or the use of force accomplish anything. Reason falls on deaf ears. So never again will we try to persuade the stupid person with reasons. It won't work. We could look at an example that follows of a lady with 2 or 3 other people inside a train travelling along. And here is the YouTube clip of a train travelling from Tehran to Surrey in wagon 9, cabin 6. And they go through a tunnel and everything goes dark and the lights go out. And then we hear the sound of a kiss. And then they come out the other side. After the sound of the kiss in the dark, there was a slap. And then after that, the question is what happened. So the woman was there, and there were these other, a general who was a ruler, and he found as they went through the dark space, he had been slapped. And he said to the woman, did you slap me? And she said, did you kiss me? If you'd kissed me, you wouldn't have been slapped. And the question is, what happened? And you might want to take a few moments to think about this. They went through a dark spot. There was the sound of a kiss. And then There was the general wiping his face because he'd been slapped, and we could bring assumptions to the evidence that is here. But if we knew a bit more, then we might be able to work out what happened in the story. And actually, the third person in the train was a soldier, and he said, "What a feeling. When we went through the dark tunnel, I kissed the palm of my hand. I slapped the colonel that I didn't like across the face, and what a great feeling." So quite different, because we didn't know what this soldier was thinking. All we saw was what the general was facing and what the woman was facing. Assumptions shape the way we think. Evidence shapes the way we think, and often we don't know everything that's going on. And that's part of the challenge of the world we live in, is how limited our knowledge is. So assumptions often affect our beliefs about what is reliable information and what is not reliable. Assumptions affect our beliefs about what is true and what is not true. And each one of us will have slightly different assumptions that are shaped by the way we were brought up, by our families, by our culture, by the nation that we live in. Another example would be a father and his son go to watch a football game together. They're driving home, they come to a railway line, the engine stops, the car's on the railway line, the train approaches, they can't move, and the father is killed instantly, the son's critically injured, taken to the hospital, and the doctor, a surgeon, comes in, looks at the boy and says, "I can't operate, it's against the code of ethics, here's my son." And you could think about this. What's going on here? And the answer is, so think about that. We might come back to that. Another one is a man lives on the 10th floor of a building, and every day he takes the lift elevator down to the ground floor, and then when he returns, he takes the lift up to the 7th floor, and then he walks up the remaining flights of stairs. Why does he do this? So pause the video now and think about that, and tell us in class what your answer to that is. So what assumptions are being made in these cases? What assumptions have been taken for granted? Default assumptions aren't necessarily bad. We've got to make some assumptions. The floor's solid, it's worth getting up today, my computer won't explode. But some things need to be challenged, and often we need that with our students as well. We should be careful that we don't squeeze out all of the assumptions people make. Here's another example. Ce n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe in French. So what does it mean when it says this is not a pipe in French? Take a few moments to write down what is meant by this picture and the words, this is not a pipe. Pause the video there and write down your thoughts. After that, we could discuss that in class. We could also think about what are some of the largest countries in the world. What about Greenland here? What about northern parts of Russia here? What are the largest countries in the world? It's possible our assumptions about maps aren't correct. Greenland is much smaller, northern United States much smaller, Russia much smaller, because the ways in which we unfold a map have to unfold a globe, like this globe behind us, so that it's spread out, and that makes islands like Greenland and parts of Russia look much larger than they have. If you look at a map of the world upside down, again, we could get uncomfortable about it, but really it's an assumption about the way the world should be. It's a cultural assumption. An example that I'm fascinated by is the way in which you can take a cylinder and look at a cylinder from side on, and you can see that that cylinder is like a rectangle. But if you look at that cylinder from end on, it's not a very good cylinder I've made there. If you look at a cylinder from end on, you can see it's like a circle. So can a rectangle or square be a circle? It can if it's a higher dimension. Certain assumptions are made looking from one side about circles, looking from side on about rectangles or squares. In actual fact, both can be true at a higher level of thinking, at a higher dimension. Over the next couple of weeks and beginning next week, we want to look at some of the ancient Greeks and their contribution, including Socrates. The only true wisdom is to know that you don't know anything, followed by Plato, his student. And Plato begins to tell us about the ideals that must underlie all things. That is, if this world has so much good in it, says Plato, if this world has so much sense of order and design in it, there must be something which is good and designed and beautiful behind these things. And so Plato develops an understanding of forms that lie behind these things, an understanding of God and truth that lie behind all things, as some of the other Greek thinkers have developed. And then his pupil, Aristotle, begins to focus on that which we know by measuring and empiricism, and he begins to look at that which we know through observation. And so Aristotle has a different view of the world to Plato and Socrates. And so we can look at some of these Greek views, which still continue to influence us these many, many years later. G.K. Chesterton in more recent times said, it's very good for a man to talk about what he does not understand, as long as he understands that he does not understand. So the implication there is that so often we need humility because we often don't understand things. In the book of Proverbs, we read in Proverbs 2:6, the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And the heart of the discerning acquires knowledge, for the ears of the wise seek it out. The discerning heart seeks knowledge, but the mouth of the fool folly. So what types of knowledge are there? We need to recognize that often knowledge requires language, and we'll look at this in weeks to come, and the language often involves metaphors, and there can be architectural metaphors, or a cloud metaphor, or a world metaphor, or a Venn diagram metaphor, or an evacuation metaphor. Often we have a number of different metaphors that can be used to express knowledge. What types of knowledge are there? There is knowledge that appears to have one correct answer, but does it? How many atoms of hydrogen are there in a water molecule? 2. But what about heavy hydrogen, light hydrogen, or other forms of, could you have heavy water? And I'd have to look into that to find out more. But we would say often there is one correct answer that we're looking for. Questions may have possible answers that require justification and judgment and reasoned judgment. So what's the best way to develop an answer to the world's debt problem? You could think through how many different answers that might there be to that. Then there are questions that have no correct answer, but depend on the person answering. For example, what type of chocolate tastes best? Let's have a look at another example here that we can discuss further in class. And in this example, let's look at this painting. And here we could ask the question, is the painting good art? And you could think about this picture or painting here. You could look at what's meant by the word good. And so how you define good could in fact shape your view of whether that is good art. If you find yourself coming up with reasons that appeal to universal ideas or standards, such as clarity, consistency, honesty, factual accuracy, and so on, then it would be a type 2 question. There could be multiple answers, but if you're looking at personal views, then you could come up with, there could be all sorts of different answers depending on who. It depends on what you're seeking in this term. Of course, if you're talking to the artist, you might be shaped by other concerns than simply saying what you want to say. You might want to be polite and give your views as to what is good art. Another question that we could reflect on, who is the greatest writer who ever lived? Does this have one answer, that there is one greatest writer? Does this have a number of answers? in which there are reasons given? Or is this a personal taste question? Or is this a cultural question in which people from different backgrounds and cultures will have different views about what is good writing? And in education, it's important to be able to address questions like this and to recognise that there can be different views held by different students about this question. And by discussing this question in class, it can be helpful to encourage the students to consider a range of viewpoints. That is, others may have different views to them, and to think about why they have different views and why it's valid for them to have different views, valid for them to hold different views. You might want to think about whether 3 categories, one answer, multiple answers, or personal taste is enough. Think about the following questions. Do they have one answer? Do they have a number of possible answers? Or do they have no correct answer in that it's personal taste? How many planets are there in the solar system? So think about that. Discuss that. Who's the Minister of Education? Think about that. Write down an answer. Discuss that. When was the French Revolution? Is it wrong to kill? What is the colour of Stephen's shirt, some person's shirt, or my shirt? What's the colour of my shirt? And what's the colour of my hair? Was Hitler a good leader? And will science eventually tell us everything about the universe, including how it started? One of the big questions. So to be a critical thinker and to encourage our students to be critical thinkers and ready for the fullness of life and for the opportunities of life, we need to understand that things aren't always what they seem. We bring assumptions, preconceptions, preconceived ideas, cultural understandings to the way we see the world, and we must examine and analyse our assumptions and preconceived ideas and where they come from. And we must be humble in looking at those. But at the same time, I think as Christians, we believe that there is truth. And we believe that logically there are reasons to believe in truth, but we need humility in our efforts to locate this. Certainly it's very difficult to come by, in all except the simplest cases, to gain certainty. Certainty is very difficult to achieve. And even in the simplest cases, we can get it wrong. Physicists tell us much of what we understand about the world around us. Table, we think it's solid. Physicists tell us that there's a lot of unseen space between the atoms in a table. Many of the things we think we know, there are scholars out there that would challenge our views on these matters. But at the same time, thinking through what we're committed to, there are truths that we hold to, and there are reasons why we hold those truths. And that's important as well in life's journey, is to understand the views that you hold and why you hold them. And at times it's important in an essay to give a few sentences. This is my background. I am the author, and this is the reasons I hold the views that I do. That can be very important. Thirdly, we're all searching for truth. And it's often hard to say with certainty when we've found it. Often we can say from our background, as a result of the influences on us in the life journey, this is our sense of understanding the truth that we have come to. There are many standards about truth that are defensible, general principles of love and caring and ethics, but there are other standards that are less defensible. Think about those things that some people hold very dear, and yet there are alternate views that could be more correct. And then finally, if we consider several positions about what we know, and if we can justify what we believe to be reasonable and unreasonable, then we'll be more mature in our thinking and we'll be better equipped to train and equip others that we teach to be more mature in their thinking as well. In order to do this, we need to understand the biases that we have and where these biases come from, including confirmation bias. That is the sense in which we already have ideas that we've heard a lot about and we've collected information on, and we often seek to confirm the ideas that we have. This is called confirmation bias. The Dunning Kruger effect is another form of bias that Dunning and Kruger came up with, and you might want to look further at the Dunning Kruger bias to find out some more about this. And so Dunning Kruger bias. And so example of Dunning-Kruger bias in psychology, a cognitive bias whereby people with limited knowledge or competence in a given intellectual or social domain greatly overestimate their knowledge or competence. So a person who's not played a great deal of soccer might feel when they kick a ball a few times, they are a great soccer player. A person who's not played a great deal of chess, when they play a chess game, the first few moves, they feel very confident about what they're doing. So limited knowledge often leads a person to overestimate their knowledge and their confidence in that particular area. Cognitive dissonance is where people seek to avoid the challenge that's faced when your thinking doesn't match up. So rather than face up to views that challenge and disagree with you and cause cognitive dissonance, often it's a lot easier to avoid that. And so that's another reason for bias. And so you might be able to think of some examples of this. Let's look at an example here, and that is the question, do scientists have a bias against religion? And some studies have claimed to have interviewed some scientists and that their study of material things, maths and measurement shows a bias against religion. And other studies have shown that there is no difference between the people who are scientists as to the number who have faith and the numbers who don't. And so that raises a whole discussion as to whether scientists have a bias against religion. I want to take a few moments now to think about this question. Are there reasons why scientists might have a bias against religion? Or is this a false dichotomy in that there are different fields to look at, a science field and a religion field, and there are different reasons for holding these, and they don't influence each other so much? Is it possible at times and in certain centuries, and I'm told by historians that those who've studied science and religion in the 1500s or 1400s in other centuries find that there are more who study science who are religious. And so is it a result of the century that people live in? Or do Christians have a bias against science? Take a few moments to think about that one, whether Christians have a bias against science. One aspect of what we're looking at here is epistemology, the theory of knowledge, the branch of philosophy that studies the nature and scope of knowledge. And the term epistemology is based on the Greek word for knowledge, episteme, and the Greek word for meaning, explanation, words, logos. So episteme, logos, epistemology means meaning and knowledge that is communicated to us. And we could then explore the ways in which language communicates meaning and knowledge, in which worldviews are important in meaning and knowledge. What shapes our epistemology? How do we learn? How do we acquire knowledge and understanding? We'll examine that. Can you think about where knowledge and understanding comes from? And as an example, if we had more time, we could look at some examples. And just one example is David Hume, who he placed humans at the center of knowledge. And so he felt that the church had claimed you make statements about what God gives to us in forms of knowledge, but really it's our ability to look at the world around us. And he contributes to a movement known as secular humanism, But there is also a Christian humanism that also believes that God has given humans capacity. And so the word humanism is shaped in different ways by those who see it as describing an emphasis on the secular, following David Hume perhaps, and those who describe an emphasis on what it means to be human and to have capacities to think and observe and to measure. David Hume said, knowledge is a way of linking ideas together. It's a human capacity. Hume emphasized sensory perceptions as a way of knowing, but did he do a disservice to intuition, to reasoning? And then the final question can be asked, can we trust our perceptions or not? Can your perceptions tell you about what happened a week ago, a year ago, 10 years ago? Can your perceptions tell you what's going to happen in the future? Can they tell you where things come from? Can they tell you if you're going to be an architect and build what's going to unfold? Are there ways of knowing, understanding, relating, and aspects of beauty and music and poetry that go beyond simply observing? Others have been skeptics and they've questioned what we can know, and we could look deeper into the concept of skepticism in the Western philosophical tradition. This too goes back to ancient Greek times, 400 years, 300 years, 500 years BC, that we can't know things for certain. And there are people today who are skeptics. And skepticism can be a healthy doubt when faced with evidence, but denial can be willful doubt when there is evidence. So skepticism is often used as a basis for atheism, but assuming that we don't know, do we need to have faith to make that? So this can be questioned as well. And if we do have faith that we're a skeptic, or do have faith that we're a believer, what shapes that faith and where do our views come from? So skepticism is another way of viewing the world around us, and we could ask some big questions about skepticism. What exists beyond what we can sense? What existence gives purpose or meaning? Why does anything exist? Why does it have order and purpose to it? And how can we know what is true? And why does personal aspects of reality exist, and love and hope? And can anything exist outside of time and space? Perhaps the real conflict at times seen between science and theology is seen by a limited naturalism that reduces everything to what can be seen in the immediate and measured, and various types of theism. And there are scientists on both sides, and theism is to believe there is that which is greater than the world around us. And we could ask which worldviews fit with that which we find in science, and we could find that there is a naturalism and a theism, again, often based on assumptions. In weeks to come, we'll have a look at mathematics and Gödel, who said that looking at the way maths works proves that there must be one who gives order. We could look at the chance of human beings having enough in the world to exist, everything coming together. And we can look in future weeks at the chance of humans existing, that if there was a big bang and if matter is spreading out and it comes together and that forms a star, and that star explodes then, and we've got more than hydrogen and helium, we've then got all the metals that are needed to make what we find on Earth, and coalesces, comes together, and then plants and animals develop, and then we have all of the things that we have around us. Could it just happen by chance? Or is the chance of that being so low? But when it comes to knowledge, it's not just a matter of having head knowledge. We need to recognize that with knowledge comes humility, acknowledging how little we know. And then as we are humble, we can start to look again at what we know. And that can be part of the maturing, growing process. Carl Jung has said, thinking is difficult. That is why people mostly judge, and judge by their assumptions without truly thinking. In this subject, we're going to be focusing on thinking that comes with humility, that helps people to grow more fully to be the people they've been called to be, in order that they might mature and grow up, and then, having matured and grown up and developed skills in thinking and critical thinking, to be able to pass those on to others so that they too can think well. And in some ways, thinking well is caught as well as taught. And so we need to catch the capacity to think well as understand some of the principles for thinking well.